welcome. Thank you all for taking the time. Okay, so does everybody have a microphone? There we go. All right. So starting at that end, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Matt Davis, Director of Government Affairs for the Port of Oakland and the Oakland Airport.
I'm Jaclyn Gnusti. I'm an engineer with Anchor QEA, and I do dredging work.
I'm Louise Bedsworth. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Planning and Research in Governor Brown's office.
And I'm Larry Goldzband, Executive Director of BCDC, the tie that was just up there.
And so now that we've got the mic checks out of the way and everybody seems to be working, we'll move on. What we're going to do is why don't we start at that end and just move down? How's that sound? All right. And a few introductory remarks. I know you have 5 to 8, but try to keep it to the 5 side, would you? Okay, sure. Because we want to get these people involved as fast as we can, and we all have limited attention spans after eating.
Sure. So I will condense my remarks. It's been like a debutante ball of coming out stories of what we need to be worried about at night that's going to keep us up. So a lot of the things that I'd planned on talking about on things that sort of risks that we're managing have already been covered. So thankfully I can go quickly through those. So from the Port of Oakland's perspective, we're a major job generator connected to certainly 80,000 jobs in the region, 800,000 throughout the country. Really living in the intersection of private commerce and public benefits. We're a steward of state lands, and so, as we look at risk, I think that we have a lot of the issues that have been covered today with natural disasters, seismic, climate change, but we're also, at the tip of the spear when it comes to the industries that operate both at the airport and the seaport. So we're looking at major business disruptions. We're looking at international bankruptcies and collapses of maritime shipping lines. We're looking at labor instability, not only in Oakland, but along the West Coast. We're looking at social activities, certainly this is the Bay Area, and how do you balance civil liberties and maintaining business continuity for the benefits of your tenants. And then certainly as we look at, a major civil works, business that we're in, how do we plan for and build and protect the infrastructure that we rely on? I think at one end of the spectrum, we've had sort of private negotiating partners that have come in and said, you guys need to be more like Facebook, move fast and break things. Let's get this deal done. And, we don't think that that's really good for our business to move fast and break things. We're erecting cranes, we're building runways, we're, protecting levees that surround the airport. So, I'm not saying that we're 180 degrees separate from that, but we're always going to be more cautious. We're going to be more methodical. But the pace of the business transformations have forced us to rapidly transform our previous way of doing business, which was be more of a static landlord that sort of just waited for the business, we would build it, they would come. And I think that under our current leadership, we've really had to become a market participant. And so even in the last year and a half, our second largest terminal operator closed up shop. Yet because we were able to forecast that and foresee some of the issues that were on the horizon, we were able to preserve all the cargo and maintain the economic benefits for the region. Literally, earlier this year, the 7th largest maritime shipping concern went bankrupt with cargo literally coming across the ocean. It was sort of well known that they were in trouble, but the rapid, sudden collapse caught a lot of people by surprise. So again, because we were able to sort of take control of that risk, within a week we had a container yard filled with empty Hanjin boxes. That if you're in the tiny house business, maybe we have a solution for affordable housing for you. Please
now
come
that's
and talk
finding
to me.
opportunity uncertainty.
Yeah. It's a risk, a threat, and an opportunity. And so essentially, that's the private partnership angle. Gotcha. And so, obviously we're a little bit closer to some of the business inputs than a traditional public agency might be. But also I think we're taking a renewed commitment to public agency partnerships. And, that's not always an easy mission, and the goals that we have and the goals that our partners have are not always aligned. And I had a grad school professor that would often refer to interagency cooperation as an unnatural act between non-consenting adults. And at times, it does feel like you're fitting, a square peg into a round hole. But you can still collaborate and harmonize and try to bring those goals together, but it's not without significant efforts. Within the realm of risk, I think I want to drill down on just one particular real-world example that we're dealing with that the goals and the outcomes aren't necessarily aligned. And it's not because anybody's doing anything wrong, but I think it's just because we're still trying to figure out how to get to the next level of cooperation. So surrounding our airport, the main Southfield passenger terminal and our runway is a levee. And the levee was built in the 50s and 60s on reclaimed land. And it also has running down the middle of it the jet fuel pipeline that services SFO. So what we know today about seismic instability and proper engineering techniques, maybe we didn't know back when it was first built. And so there's a not so theoretical risk that if there were a major quake on the Hayward Fault, this levee or a portion of it might fail. And in turn would also take out passenger operations and cargo operations at SFO. So at a time in which both airports would be most needed for airlift and disaster assistance, they could potentially be out of commission for an indeterminate period of time. That being said, the way that our interrelationship with our federal partners, I'm not calling anybody out specifically, but when FEMA comes and looks at the levee, they see it as, well, you're at risk for a century flood. And maybe we'll have some after disaster recovery assistance for you, but our concern is your ability to withstand a major storm surge. And we're concerned about that too. But the major thing that's driving us is seismic, and how do we deal with that? And there's no immediate sort of funding options that are really cleanly knit for that sort of a project. And you heard from Brad Benson earlier at the Port of San Francisco about how they're dealing with that on perhaps a larger scale. And so for us, the two options dealing with storms and floods and dealing with seismic, it's not mutually exclusive. We can engineer both, and we actually have provided a solution. But like any simple solution, it just comes down to some money. I think that we're obviously trying to get FEMA to be a little bit more responsive and maybe assist us. The FAA, which provides a lot of money for our runway and for safety areas that surround the runway, won't provide money for the structure that protects their investment. So obviously trying to work with them as well to be a little bit more liberalized in their thinking about total asset protection. And I think that, obviously it's easy to kick a dead horse and talk about the lack of action in Washington. In our case, there is a turnkey solution. It does require an act of Congress, but it's not a new funding mechanism. And it's called the passenger facility charge. Many of you, all of you who've flown through a major airport pay a very small user fee that gets reinvested in the airport. This fee's been frozen for 17 years. It was originally a Reagan-conceived idea, so it's not a liberal, not a conservative. I don't think it's boxed into any one partisan maneuver. So I think, we do have hopes that this year, absent, the waning days of our democracy that we might see with our president, I think that we could see some action on that, and we would certainly be hopeful. The state government, certainly with the recent bill that they've passed, the regional government, our county, everybody's stepping up, and I think that that's still the big partner that we're waiting to see come to the table. So, thank you.
Okay. And next up is Jaclyn. And so, okay, the theme here is finding opportunity in uncertainty, which could be anything from making a buck off a disaster to trying to push ahead an agenda or work that needs to be done because it's all going to fall apart. Where do you see it?
Well, I'm from the dredging industry. My day job is designing and running dredging projects, and then my side gig is with Bay Planning Coalition's Dredging and Beneficial Reuse Committee. So I focus on how do we take all this awesome sand and mud that we're dredging up and use it creatively and responsibly without bankrupting everybody in the process. So the risks.
Go ahead.
The risks that I see that integrate with the dredging community are related to sea level rise and infrastructure risks, risks to the environment, and we've talked about it a little bit, but risks to economy and industry. So the first is sea level rise, the big question of the day. And pretty clearly, I'm being told by smarter people than me, you can take the dredge material and bolster up the shorelines and protect those vulnerable areas. So that's pretty cool. The second is habitat, and that's something we've been talking about for decades. So you can take the dredge material, you could build a wetland and get habitat, which is great for the environment. Now, if you're creative enough that you can take the habitat and make it the bolstering feature, double win. I don't want to say kill two birds with Larry sitting next to me, but you've achieved two goals. One problem, though, that we're seeing with that opportunity is it's very expensive and difficult to get dredge material where it needs to go to achieve those two, or to mitigate those two risks. And right now, we only have 2 locations that are actively, largely taking dredge material. They're incredible. I love everything about them, except they're only located in Solano County. If you were looking at all those maps of sea level rise, it's everywhere. And everybody wants their habitat better. Everybody wants their shoreline bolstered. So it's really hard to look at a dredger who's coming from maybe Central South Bay and say, you're gonna have to pay 3-4 times the amount of money that you paid way back when, but you're not getting the immediate adjacent benefit. It's going towards someone else in the bay. So, the impacts, which was the third to the economy and industry, they're real. I know we just heard our economy is doing great, and I'm really happy to hear that. But I do have to say, I know a couple entities that are not doing okay. Some can absorb, some have to modify their operations in minor to significant ways, and some are even kind of packing up shop and just saying, I can't stay. So those might be isolated incidences, but that is happening in our region, and it's a real risk to our structure as a community. So harping on the risks, we could get into the solutions and where do we go now, which is apparently the point of our panel. And I'm not a big visionary, but I see things. I've been dredging about 20 years. I've been quietly watching and observing what works. And the 2 places I think we can really focus our energy and our money, I guess, are 1, I really feel like any decision that's made with dredge material needs to be done with agreed upon current science and current updated policy. We've had a lot of discussions about policy and how things are changing with science, and our discussions are fantastic. But for example, the LTMS work plan was written with language like, we need to move material out of the bay. We need to stop putting material in the bay, except for habitat restoration. And I know that wasn't really the spirit of it, but that language is still there, and some people still harken back to that. Well, now that we're hearing that there's a sediment deficit and we need sea level rise bolstering, it's kind of counter to some of those statements. So not everybody is up to speed yet, I feel. I feel like some people are still looking back a few decades. So I feel like that is really important, and focusing on some of those more out of the box-ish or maybe taboo-ish things like strategic placement in bay. You get the cheap disposal, but the benefit of possible bolstering and wetland restoration. Another is that dreaded yet beloved ATF concept. It makes sense in a lot of ways, and I think people need to stop being afraid of those discussions and really have them seriously if we're going to achieve the goals that we're looking for. So the second thing I think we should do to focus on for risk mitigation is funding. And I know that's easy to say. If money was easy, I think we'd all be on a beach with a cocktail and not here right now. But we need money. We need supplemental funding for beneficial reuse. Right now, the cost is falling on the dredgers only. So, maybe a shipyard is paying a lot of money to protect the entire bay. And I think the money needs to come from elsewhere to supplement that differential. So a few things, here's my little plug for Bay Planning, John, that our group has been looking into. We're supporting the Corps with the WIN-WRDA funding, looking for pilot project funding for WIN-WRDA Act. Another pretty cool thing is Measure AA that you already heard about and all of you know about. Measure AA, in my opinion, is a gift from the taxpayers of the Bay Area. They want something to happen. And so I don't know if any of you are on the advisory boards who manage the use of those funds, but please don't waste it. This is a huge opportunity, and we're watching. We're watching what you do with our dollars. And another new concept, which is fairly new to me, I just found out that California is one of the few, or maybe the only coastal state that doesn't have a line item in the budget for beneficial reuse of dredge material, which seems crazy to me given our economy. It should be there. I know we have a lot of things to spend money on, but I think we can move some money around there. So Our committee and your legislature committee, right, has been working together to come up with an economic study to prove the importance to dredging in the Bay Area and to the economy, to the safety and sea level rise. And we're hoping to take that economic study and submit it and work to get state funding. So again, those are the two things. I think we all have the same vision. We just have different ways of getting there. But if we focus on those two things, agreeing on current updated facts and really working hard to get that funding, we might, make a little more progress. So thank you.
And now we'll hear from the state.
I don't have any money.
Did you just say we're going to give money?
No. Yeah, so I guess I'll start. What we've been working a lot on over the last, several years is really trying to assist local governments, but also state agencies to integrate climate impacts into planning. And so knowing we have a lot to do, and it is going to take additional money, but a lot of what we're trying to work on is how do we make this part of our standard practice and the way we do business at the state level, the way we plan and invest, the way we would design and build infrastructure, and on down through the regions and local governments. In thinking about that, I think one thing that we are very lucky to be starting with is that we all accept and acknowledge that change is happening and it's likely to get worse. And so we don't have to go through that process of accepting the science of climate change and the impacts it's going to have on our region. So we have a couple of recent directives that I'm sure you've heard about. Executive Order B3015, which was signed in April of 2015, which gave direction to state agencies to integrate climate into all planning and investment, including infrastructure investment, to use full life cycle cost accounting in doing infrastructure investment, and it gave our office at OPR a directive to build a guidance document for state agencies to do that. So we've spent about the last 12 months working on that document with a whole range of stakeholders. And I think two things really became clear, not surprising, but two key pieces we had to work on, which were what do we plan for? What's the number that we tell everybody? Because that's what everybody says is give us a number. It's really a set of numbers, but what is it we should be planning for? But I think equally importantly is how do we plan and invest differently in a more uncertain, more rapidly changing, in an environment where we have surprises. And so we've been working on that document, and it should be coming out soon, really to sort of help. We don't give a number, I'll spoil the surprise now, but we really try to talk about how to think about the context of the decision and situate yourself in that range of uncertainty. And where do you want to be more precautionary? Where can you be more optimistic with a range of factors for consideration? Another directive, so that's the state side. On the local side is Senate Bill 379, which directs local governments to integrate climate change into the safety element of their general plan. And so we've been working on that guidance, which will also be coming out very soon. I think a couple of challenges have arisen in doing this work. And that's first, as we know, the science is changing. So how do we keep up with that? What is the role of government to be on the cutting edge of science, but to create a pretty predictable, guidance guidance situation? The other is the integration of local knowledge. So sort of both local science and locally produced information, but local information around risks and vulnerabilities and how climate risk sits alongside other risks and vulnerabilities that local communities are facing. And then finally, and this is especially true, I think at all levels of government, is the very different starting points that different state agencies are at right now in their capacity, resources, and ability to address these issues. So one example that I think where we're really tackling this head on, and I know is a topic that John had asked that I talk more specifically about, is the update to the state's sea level rise guidance. And so we undertook, led by the Ocean Protection Council, a process just getting underway to update the state's sea level rise guidance. And this was instigated or sort of prompted by two things. One, I mentioned Senate Bill 379, which calls out local governments to bring climate change into the safety element of their general plan. And so now we have two audiences for this document, state agencies, but also local governments who are trying to provide guidance to. And then the second is the rapidly changing science, and especially the emerging studies and science on the effects of ice melt on sea level rise. And so we undertook, and as I said, led by the Ocean Protection Council, but in partnership with the California Energy Commission, the Natural Resources Agency, our office, OPR, and others, a process basically on two tracks to look at how we do this. One was to undertake a scientific a process to summarize the science, not to produce new information, but to take the science that's out there, work with a team of scientists to say, what is this telling us about the impacts of ice melt and other factors on rising sea levels? What does that mean for California? And that process was also guided by a suite of questions that came from a policy advisory committee. Alongside that, and in somewhat parallel but connected process, if that's possible, it's an alternative fact. So we also have been doing a process of engagement to understand how are people using the guidance? How has it been used in the past? How do they want to use it in the future? Working with state agencies, local and regional governments, and other stakeholders. And that process started while the science summary work was happening and is that now continuing. So a couple of things we learned and in this report that was from the existing literature. The relative contributions to sea level rise are changing. Before now, up till now, it's mostly been thermal expansion of water and melting glaciers. As we look to the future, melting ice sheets, especially Greenland and Antarctica, are likely to take over and become the dominant source of, the dominant contributor to sea level rise. Also, really interestingly, is the fact that, because this is like, I think, fascinating, but because of the impacts on the gravitational field of the Earth of melting ice sheets, and especially in Antarctica, the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet is going to have a disproportional impact on the coast of California. So if on average you get about a foot of sea level rise around the globe, in California we'll see about 1.25 or 1.25 feet of sea level rise. And this is because of the gravitational forces. So this is all a science that really prompted us to think, okay, what are we gonna do? And so the science summary came out, and what it provided was first an update. Our last guidance document was based on a 2012 National Academy of Sciences study. So this new science summary basically was able to take the existing information and put it into a probabilistic framework. So instead of just having a straight range, for different tide gauges around the state, they were able to give probabilities of exceeding certain levels of sea level rise at different points in time. The report, if you haven't looked at it, is really interesting. I think it presents the information in a lot of different ways. It can be a little overwhelming, but it is a pretty interesting and I think useful summary and different ways to look at the information. Another piece that came out of this was, what can we say about an extreme ice melt scenario? And what became very clear, and was the consensus of the scientists who did the work, is that we cannot put a probability around that. So we can look at these other processes that are contributing to sea level rise and put that into this probabilistic range. But right now, we cannot say what the probability of an extreme ice melt scenario is. And so we have an extreme scenario of about 10 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century that has no probability associated with it. So this summary document was taken to the Ocean Protection Council last week, and they have started, passed a resolution to start a process to update the guidance document. And this will continue through a series of public workshops and engagement to really think about how do we use this science, how do we take this science and work with local information, how do we provide guidance on how to situate yourself in that uncertainty, and then what is the process for continuing to update this as we move forward?
I think that's where we move on to
okay.
Larry as well.
Right.
Larry, you're the one that sits here and goes through all of that information and decides whether it's going to be fire, famine, flood, earthquake, or the melting ice cap.
Don't forget pestilence.
Pestilence is in there too, as is mosquito abatement. You are the man in charge of the entire Bay Area.
So So I just got a promotion.
You did. Keep at it. We're going to get you all Northern California by this.
Demotion, Phil. That's not what. So let me take where Louise went and go a little bit into the weeds, or the eelgrass, as we say at BCDC. And I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about planning, I want to talk about regulation, and then I'm going to do something that Louise didn't do. I'm going to give you a number. I'm going to give you 2 numbers. First, planning. When it comes to uncertainty, the best thing that planning can do is to separate wheat from chaff and provide your audience, your stakeholders, with real information that they can use to actually plan. My favorite example of that happens to be Matt's favorite airport, which is Oakland. You've all seen the inundation maps. If you look at the inundation map, you see half of the Oakland airport underwater, right? It's all theoretical. Of course it is. Of course it is. So what we do at BCDC is we ground truth things. We actually go out there and try to figure out what's really going on. It turns out that if you patch 4 different little holes around Doolittle Drive, the airport doesn't flood under most every circumstance that we can see. So you're thinking, great, let's go to the city of Oakland and have the city of Oakland patch Doolittle Drive. The city of Oakland doesn't own Doolittle Drive. So you go to the county of Alameda. They don't own Doolittle Drive. Who owns Doolittle Drive? Say it again. Caltrans. It's a state highway. Under Caltrans, and I love Bijan Sartipi, under Caltrans' way of evaluating the efficacy of a road, Doolittle Drive is a star. There is no cost-benefit analysis, as far as I can tell, that they can really do, which says they have to spend X amount of money to do this, to fix Doolittle Drive, because Doolittle Drive's not broken. That's the kind of coordination and collaboration that is required to get something done. And that's why planning is so incredibly important, because it actually ground truths what's really going on. Second, regulation. There are at least 4 different types of uncertainty that I'm worried about. The first is scientific uncertainty. We don't know when it's going to hit, and we don't know how much is going to hit us. We just know it's going to hit us. Second, financial uncertainty. Because of the scientific uncertainty, that causes disruptions in the markets, and in the real estate markets, and in every other market. And therefore, that then causes us, as people who live in the Bay Area, to actually move around a little bit and be disrupted. Third, ecological uncertainty. How does it actually happen? Can the horizontal levees actually grow fast enough to provide resilience? And finally, social uncertainty. What happens to the underserved communities of East Palo Alto, West Oakland, the Canal District in San Rafael, Alviso, Richmond, because they have to be part of any solution you have. Third, and then finally, on the permitting side, how do you write a permit that is based on an uncertain future? I don't know how you do that yet. Finally, let me give you a number to cure a little bit of your uncertainty. Last Thursday, Professor Gary Griggs from UC Santa Cruz or Davis, where's he from? Santa Cruz, who's part of the science team that developed the probabilistic scenarios, blah, 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 sat down with BCDC's Finance in the Future Working Group, went through the entire study with our commissioners and the other members of the working groups who are investment bankers and lawyers and anybody who does finance. And at the end of the day, one person asked him, he said, "Professor, what do you do in 2050 and what do you do in 2100? And he said, for 2050, 18 to 24 inches. For 2100, 3 to 4 feet. Then he paused and he said, but it could be higher.
All right. So, I'm trying to figure out, are we on the verge of an apocalypse or is this manageable? Hands up. Apocalypse or manageable? Manageable? Manageable or apocalypse? Apocalypse. Apocalypse or manageable? Manageable. We got two manageable.
I'm the optimist. I think it's more than manageable. We can actually thrive because we're ahead of everybody else. We have a first mover advantage.
That's my next question. If we look at the Bay Area and the population we have, and we take a look at the cities and everything like that, a lot of it was initially part of the Bay, right? Alameda was part of the Bay. Your port and airport were part of the Bay. I'm not sure we could build either under his rules, but they are part.
I believe we finished Southfield
Downtown San
3 years
Francisco.
before BCDC was created. So
Exactly. They wouldn't have it. Downtown San Francisco was underwater. It's now reclaimed. Now, in each of those cases, the reason I bring them up is because each of these people have talked about, rightfully so, funding, the idea of money. Is there a way to make this profitable? Because that is where you're going to have to eventually go, because you can be asking for money left and right, but if they repeal health care, that state budget is going south as you're nodding your head, and you can say goodbye to climate change and everything else. We're not going to be launching any satellites. We're going to be down at the emergency room. So is there a way to make this profitable rather than just regulatory? Who wants to grab that?
I guess one thing I would say is, and I was saying to Larry, I think this is at least my second panel with a BCDC representative in the last 2 weeks. I mean, I actually do think the first mover is critical. I think Measure AA is critical. I think what you guys are doing at BCDC with the the Art Bay Area project is incredible, which is really looking across the issues. We need to stop. I mean, sea levels are going to rise. They're going to rise 10 feet, they're going to rise 100 feet. We don't know when. So we have to figure out what are we going to do about it and how are we going to start doing that. And that's what BCDC is getting, I think, is leaps and bounds ahead of others in being able to say that, and can really be a model for other parts of the state, is that we just accept we're not going to know the number. And we're going to start figuring out how do we do it, how does it work with our priority development areas, our priority conservation areas, how do we work with Caltrans and all the other partners to start figuring out what do we do? Because it's the number, we could talk about the number till we're all underwater, or we can, just start doing something. And I think what BCDC is probably getting us closer to, to doing that.
So Larry, how do we do this and make it so that it has its own financial engine and incentives?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is differentiate between rising sea level and earthquakes in terms of one thing. Because we heard a lot about seismic earlier and how they're connected, and they are.
And don't forget drought and flood, because if we were having this discussion 2 years ago about floods, we would all be going, what are you, nuts? We're in the middle of the 100-year drought, right? And now we're on the cusp of floods.
So I have a question. Of those of you here, how many of your families actually have an earthquake emergency packet or kit that everybody knows where it is and how to use it? About 2/3. And that's of a very, very sophisticated audience. Scaring people into preparing doesn't work. So what we do at BCDC is educate people about how they can actually look at their communities, find strength within their communities. And we've done this in Hayward, we've done it in Contra Costa County, we've done it in San Mateo, we're about to expand into Brentwood and places like that, and actually make sure that people understand how they can thrive.
Right, but that's education, but that's, again, we have to come to the funding. Are there ways to say, because here's where it gets dicey. Here's where it gets dicey for everybody, is dredging is a classic example. Yes, we want it done, but how we want it done necessarily doesn't make it profitable or make it economically feasible. You want to preserve the bay, but you don't want necessarily development, because there's a part of your group that doesn't want that, right?
But that's not right, actually, Phil, and I have to correct you. BCDC's approved bajillions of dollars in development and will continue to approve bajillions of dollars in development. And the commission has said basically publicly, and you can ask any of the commissioners who are around here today or have been here the last few years, they are prepared to say yes to dumping cubic yards of dirt in the bay that would have made, Mel Lane go like this as the first chair, in order to do multi-benefit projects like resilience and creating habitat. And there will also be, as my chair, Zach Wasserman, says, gray infrastructure in the bay too. It's going to happen. So the question is, how do you make it happen so that it's multiple benefit? It cures a bunch of things all at once.
Right, it makes, yeah.
And I would just say that, I mean, I don't know how you, if the question is how you profit off sea level rise, I don't really know how you structure that, but I mean, we've seen an evolution, you know, with dredging. Certainly, it used to be dredged spoils. They were a useless asset that were dumped that didn't have any value. And now that we've actually seen the adaptive reuse, we've seen the ability to sort of monetize that for the purposes of, you know, reducing the public disbenefits that we're all trying to get to. So, I mean, how you can quantify that from an economic sense, there's certainly, you know, an $8 billion pot of money that's sitting in Washington that has been collected from people that ship through our port and other ports that, you know, for a number of reasons is not being spent on its intended purposes, but it is, you know, Larry's doing a great job, BPC is doing a great job in trying to unlock some of that to really have us be a leader. And certainly the more that we can lead, and, you know, even if some people aren't going to follow, they are going to suffer some of the same pitfalls that we're experiencing. They're just not going to be ready for them.
So could you take her dredging and your money and plug his Doolittle Drive to save your airport? That seems like a pretty quick way.
Well, it would depend on what type of sediment we're looking at. But I mean, I think that, I mean, again, I think we are doing that. And so we are expanding the opportunities to reuse this. And the question just then becomes balancing the trade-offs between the environmental goals and making it affordable. So it's really not, you know, it's not a complicated calculus equation.
It's rarely complicated, but it rarely gets done.
You're right, it's simple in theory, but a problem that I've seen is over the last maybe 15 years, people, you know, ports and everybody else, they have long-term budget plans, and the tack has kind of changed a little bit, whereas people felt you're supposed to bring, you know, if you can't afford to go to beneficial reuse, you got to go to the ocean. No, just kidding, don't take it to the ocean. And so that's where I say, I think we all in our hearts know what the right thing to do is, but there's just a little bit of confusion over what the policy says, what certain individuals feel like implementing in their respective position in whatever agency they're in, and what we actually need to do with it. So we're close, we have an understanding, but there's just some details that need to be ironed out, like getting a whole bunch of money and really agreeing on what we're gonna do, you know. And I was just saying, I don't know if I'm old now or things have just changed, but the fact that some of the policies have changed so much since I've only been working 18 years, and it's kind of shocking. You know, 18 years really isn't that long, and when we're saying, no, we have a sediment deficit now, we didn't know about it before, but now we do. It's just a lot to swallow quickly, and you know, I think we just need to stop, get up to speed, get on the same page, and then go forward united.
As we go forward, one of the big questions is the future on regulations. Is the state legislature the group to be doing it?
The group to be doing it?
Yeah. When we go through Sacramento, you go through the legislature. Now everybody says stakeholders. I see the stakeholders in the hearing rooms, and I see the power brokers in the hallways.
So I would say for the port's perspective, and I'll have to be very careful here, you know, we've been able, I think, through a lot of hard work, through a lot of the partnerships, and through a lot of the, you know, both a mix of funding and regulation, to make dramatic improvements in the status of our air quality. We've had it reduced by 75% in a little over 12 years, and we have a pathway to get even further. What I would say is that there is an expectation or perception that the ways that we've been able to get there, that those technologies, those procedures, those policies are mature and have been adopted. And they haven't. You know, we're still trying to figure out, with the example of like ships that are plugging into the electric grid, we're having to design massive extension cords because the ships are so much larger than we ever expected they would be. And you don't buy that at Radio Shack. And it's a very complicated marine environment with trucks and people, and you know, it's just not mature. I think secondary to that, or actually paramount to that, is the fact that we're sort of breaking the tape on a bit of a marathon and achieving some great successes, but nobody else really has come up to the starting line. And I think that to the extent that we want to continue to work with Sacramento, and the folks there and at the Air Resources Board are eminently qualified to work with us to find reasonable solutions, but we have seen a lagging indicator of 49 other states that just don't have the same standards. So we don't want to move backward, we want them to come up, But at the risk of sounding like I'm I'm being a reactionary, we do kind of want a little bit of a timeout, just to
What,
let this
you're
process.
not interested in being the front runner for people that just aren't following?
It's about balance. It's
It's a balance because they're selling it cheaper and it's competition.
And-
But you're doing the right thing.
And I would say that our current president, the current administration, is not helping things because it's forcing us, rightfully so, in my personal political philosophy, to be a counterbalance to that. And I think that we're going to continue to be a leader, and so we're struggling with this every day.
And let's give a plug to Louise and her colleagues up in Sacramento, because no matter what this administration does with regard to climate change, that administration is not backing down. And there are things it can do through the regulatory system that it will continue to do even if Obamacare goes away. But here's my point on that, and that is that when I talk to folks in Sacramento, I say, and this is what you all saw when John Joya spoke and when you voted, nobody's really interested in having a fifth regional agency around this place. I mean, brand new from whole cloth that, at least nobody's wrong, but not many people are. And the state legislature isn't really either. And when you consider that people like Phil Ting and Bob Wykowski, who are major budget players in Sacramento, are former BCDC commissioners, they understand that it's better to try to get stuff done under the current system than try to create something new from whole cloth. So I don't think we're at the Sacramento point yet. But that's why our commission said, give it a couple of years, let's see if we can get it done, and if not, then we'll look at new authority.
Okay. Quickly.
Just one thing I would say is stepping back, I think there are important roles the legislature can play in enabling certain pathways for doing financing. There's an example from last session where you can finance watershed work like green infrastructure and making that part of how you finance water infrastructure. And so that, to be able to use that tool to be doing work in the watershed is critically important from a resilience standpoint. That was an act of the legislature. So I think there are places where they do have an important role, and they certainly have gotten a lot more active on adaptation and resilience legislation in the last few years. So, I think there's a lot of interest in it. So I think you will continue to see stuff happening.
Would like to open it up to questions from the floor. So if anybody has a question, just stand up or raise your hand. Right over here. Oh, you got a microphone? There we go.
No. All right. At the risk of sounding naive, doesn't it make sense to consolidate the regional agencies we have, like BCDC, ABAG, Regional Water Quality Control Board, all of the above? Wouldn't that kind of make sense?
Why?
Your boards.
So?
Well, you just said you didn't want more. He said the question is, does it make sense to have less?
The question, here's the answer, which is that in theory, each of those boards has a fundamentally different purpose. BCDC's purpose is different than the water boards, which is different than the air boards, which is different than MTCs, which isn't even a regulatory agency, which is different than Mike Connor's wastewater treatment folks. And so I would argue that what you actually need to do is figure out, which is what we are doing now more than ever, how to not get in each other's way, and more to the point, how to do multi-agency permitting in a way that reduces the time that is required to get projects done. So from my perspective, you could talk about, and then you also have to lay in the fact that some of those boards are local versus regional versus state versus federal. I think there's actually more of a difficulty to try to collaborate and coordinate among the different levels of government, between federal and state, for example, than there is among the state.
Have any of you been to the new MTC headquarters in San Francisco? I really recommend you take the trip because they have all those agencies under one roof, and it's phenomenal. You're going to go there too. And it's all being paid for with toll money from cars, which are really bad. But it is really an incredible building. And I walked in there and I said, I can't believe it. It looks like the UN. And you'll be going in there too, so you'll all be in the same area.
And what Steve and Jack, Heminger and Broadbent, are doing is creating the plan so that our planners are sitting right with MTC's planners and the Air District's planners and ABAG's planners so that stuff gets done in real time concurrently and with each other as opposed to ad seriatim.
Okay. One of the things I find interesting real quick is that I cover these plans and actually read them. I find them fascinating and such. And we do all these plannings around the Bay Area, and then you wake up one morning and you find out that Brentwood's happened, or that people are driving in from Tracy, or that somebody's got an idea for high-speed rail, and all of a sudden that shifts it over. Or you wake up one morning and with all your talk about, we're going to, around the Bay and stuff like that, somebody decides to build a sports arena one place, another guy decides that he wants his high-tech campus in a flood zone, and nobody stops him. Okay, money is money. Anybody else have a question? I think you've stunned everybody into silence.
We have a question over here. I'm walking over with the mic.
It seems like we have a ton of expertise in the Bay Area around science and engineering and planning solutions to sea level rise. It seems like the real challenges that we face, multiple challenges, but the real challenges we face that I think have been highlighted here are both governance and finance. And if we're going to come up with some revolutionary solutions, we need to be thinking in those areas. And those are areas where we seem to have, a very few number of I think consultants, a few academics. I just wonder, let's just talk about finance, and this is a question for any of you. Who in your mind, or do you have anybody that you think is thinking or looking creatively, either in the private sector or the academic sector, about creative solutions to some of these finance questions that we have to kind of reinvent government, to find ways of funding, settlement solutions and such?
Right. Other than another proposition for a tax.
I mean, this is not a sea level rise example, but I've been working on a project up in Tuolumne County on resilience post-rim fire that has forest and watershed health work happening. And we're funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it's a partnership of local, state, and federal agencies to do the work. And we've been talking with a group who's been working on a pay-for-success model to get multiple payers in, essentially, who are benefiting from the work in the forest and watershed. So energy utilities, water utilities, and others, Farm Bureau, et cetera, to all basically come to the table because they're all benefiting from doing work. And so it's a new idea that's gotten a lot of attention in that part of the world. But I think there are people in the private sector who are trying to come up with ways to capture the multiple benefits, to bring more investors to the table, and think about different models that we could apply to doing this work. And I mentioned the example of the legislation around being able to finance watershed work as green infrastructure. So I think there are examples where this is happening, but it's certainly a very big area of both academic work, but I think practical work too, where people are trying to test things on the ground.
I mean, I would say from our perspective, we do receive grants for some capital developments, but we don't receive general tax dollars for the operations. I mean, we've been operating a P3 for over 50 years. And so, I think that we're pretty well established and nestled in the private revenue sector, and certainly both on our maritime and our aviation side, we're entirely dependent on the success of our business partners. So, I think that we would actually like to see a little bit more public participation because airports and ports are not an isolated node in the transportation system, that we're highly dependent and we highly impact all the planning work that gets done in the Bay Area. I think that the one thing I would sort of be cautious of is certainly the current, administration's model of infrastructure growth or investment tends to involve a lot of privatizations. And I think that, given the theme of what we talked about today, a lot of what we've seen tends to sort of centralize the profit with that private operator and then centralize the risk with the public. And so I think that's not something that, we're particularly interested in privatizing our airport. We've seen San Juan, St. Louis just announced some plans to potentially explore that. So again, I think alternative financing is always great, but there are limits into what the public's actually getting from that bet.
Let me say one more thing, and that is that, to answer Warner's question, the kind of finance you're going to need over the next 100 to 150 years to do whatever it is we're all going to end up doing, and our grandkids and their grandkids are going to do, is what we're calling intergenerational finance. You cannot have a financial process which enforces people to pay for something which either didn't work or is out of date. You're going to have to figure out a way to do finance that coincides and is concurrent with the protection that you actually have. That is going to make project finance fundamentally change. And I can't tell you any more than that, because right now we're just trying to figure out how we even start thinking about it.
Larry, we're talking about development, and you've approved massive developments. So do you see the day when we reclaim and have these gray areas, or what do you call it, green areas, that would have condos on them?
Well, I think that one of the really interesting issues that BCDC is going to have to take up, not in the next 5, probably to 10 years, but in the next generation of leadership, is how you deal with cash flow and finance when the shoreline is clearly not going to be permanent anymore. And that may well involve things like development of a different sort in places that we didn't have before.
When you mean, we're talking about money-making deals?
Well, that's
like
a great
condos.
question.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't think that, I don't see our commission at this point doing that. But I do see in the future that there being an entirely different way of looking at the Bay and looking at the people who live in the Bay Area, because nature forces us to do so.
Right, but politics also dictates part of our solutions. At the port, for example, you're trying to make money, and you have a city council in Oakland that wants to dictate what you can and can't bring into that port, right?
I knew you were going to ask this. So as a broad disclaimer, that's not our project.
Right, but it is your port.
Excuse me?
Exactly. But the point being that we have this component on top of it. If it was all just engineering and let's go from point A to point B, that would be one thing. But if we have to go to point A to point B in the correct manner that preserves what we have now, some people say that is a recipe for a hands out forever, and you're going to be in competition with everybody else. And people are going to say, enough. Did you agree?
They might.
They might.
Well, I think what you're getting at, Phil, is really, really important. And that's why I tend to look at rising sea level not in terms of feet and inches, but in terms of time and tranches of time. I think that what the Bay Conservation Development Commission is going to do over the next 3 to 5 years is going to deal with the next 25 to 40 years. After we get through that period of discussion, say in the next 5 to 10 years, then the commission's going to have to take a look at the next 50 years. And so I think if you take a look at it in tranches of time, that's where you're going to get to what you're getting at, which is that there are going to be fundamentally different ways of approaching the way we live with the Bay.
But another point is that we have the legislature, and you said that the legislature is not backing down from Washington. They're absolutely not. They are charging ahead. But they're charging ahead 10 years and 15 years down the line. They're setting goals. They're great at setting goals. In other words, they're great at not backing down, but they're not very good at backing up what it is that they've proposed. Whether it's in education or transportation, when you say, okay, where is the money or the clout to get something done? They say, no, that's for everybody else to work out. We're setting the goals. Here's our press release. So, on the state level or whatever, when we have these planning goals, how realistic are they? Because when you were talking, you were saying we have this, what was it, 10 feet? You said it could.
Extreme.
Right, and you said, but that's extreme, it's not going to happen. But I will go out there. It is going to happen.
We just can't say when.
We just can't say when.
Right.
So how do you balance the
Well, and I guess the other thing I will add, maybe for the legislature's defense, I don't know, but there is money for adaptation in SB 1. And there's money for planning, both for meeting SB 375 and for adaptation, and a lot of conversations about how to best use that. So I do think there are bits of money that are out there to try to support meeting those goals. And the investments from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, from our cap and trade revenues that have gone into affordable housing and sustainable communities, intercity rail projects, transformational climate communities, all of those programs, I think are making investments that sort of back up trying to make some of the changes we want to see happen from the programs that we have in place to meet our goals.
Is it enough?
I mean, I think probably everyone would say no, it's not enough. I mean, when we look at the challenges, it's enormous. And I think at the end of the day, when we look at the impacts of climate change, it's not something the public sector is going to be able to take care of all of on its own, is getting the whole state ready. It's going to be a collaborative effort from, I think, the public sector, the private sector, the state and the federal government and others to make it happen. I don't think any of us know exactly what that looks like, but no, and I think as you look at those tranches of time, it's really important they can't be disjointed, because you can't be making investments in that first tranche of time that are going to limit your ability. So while you can look at that 15 to or 25 to 40 years, you have to be looking at that with an eye towards a pathways approach, so that you know that when you get here, if you're not where you thought you were going to be, if it's better or worse, you can adjust accordingly in those next 50 years. So, we can break it up as best we can, but it really is a whole new challenge to how we think about planning for the future that we haven't had in the past.
All right, I'd like to do a little poll before we go. And now, we started out by asking them apocalypse or opportunity. Having listened, how many vote apocalypse? How many vote opportunity? Well, I think you've done a pretty good job then, all right? And I think at that, we're just going to let it go and move right on.
Can I ask one question?
Wait a minute, is that John Coleman?
It is.
You're paying for this microphone, aren't you?
I'm paying for it, so yeah. Going back to Reagan. We all agree there's a problem. We all agree there's a solution. If there's a single impediment, state, federal, local, regional, or NGO, to getting to our solution, what is it and who is it?
Oh, everybody jump in for that one. Feel free, water's deep.
I didn't hear a solution that we all agreed upon. I mean, I think we have a solution set, but I don't know if there's one silver bullet that I've heard today.
So, John, it's a great question, and I'm going to answer it this way. The impediment that we have is not a tangible impediment. It's an intangible impediment, and it's impatience. It's the fact that if we don't do this right, we're going to all be screwed. To do it right, it's going to take some time, and it's going to take some planning, and it's going to take some coordination and collaboration. And one thing I want to make sure we don't do is confuse what we have to do with rising sea level with what's been done for earthquake preparedness. We have to actually have all the underserved communities and folks who live by the bay and folks in Lafayette and Livermore all basically at the point where they recognize that the planning is happening and it's going to affect them, and it's just going to take a little bit of time.
So you're saying we need political will and backbone to move forward?
Ultimately, we'll need a lot of political will, yeah.
All right, and we all know we're good at political will. Just look at the elections. All right, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you all much for attending as well.